Some people think stealing a house takes a crowbar. The truth is, all it really takes is a smile, a fake vote, and neighbors willing to believe the wrong person. The smell of pine needles drifted through the open window of my pickup as I climbed the last winding mile toward Black Ridge. Every curve in that mountain road carried a memory. My grandfather taught me how to drive up here when I was 14, telling me that the mountain always rewarded patience and punished arrogance. I hadn't seen the cabin in almost 7 months. A bridge restoration project outside Denver had kept me working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and by the time each contract ended, another one had already begun. I figured the old place would be exactly the way I left it. Quiet, empty, waiting. Instead, I caught the faint scent of charcoal drifting through the trees before I even reached the final bend. At first I smiled. Maybe one of my neighbors was grilling for the holiday weekend. Then I rounded the corner, and my hands tightened around the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My grandfather's cabin wasn't empty. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. 2 expensive SUVs sat in the gravel driveway where my old Ford usually rested. Flower baskets I had never bought hung from the porch railings. Fresh paint covered the cedar siding. Wind chimes tinkled softly where my grandfather used to hang his fishing lantern. Laughter spilled out through an open window like I had stumbled onto someone else's family vacation. I killed the engine and listened. The mountain was supposed to sound peaceful. Instead, I heard glasses clinking, music floating across the trees, and people talking about weekend reservations. Reservations. At my cabin, I stepped onto the porch, the familiar wood creaking beneath my boots exactly the way it always had since I was a kid. Before I could reach for the doorknob, the front door swung open. Standing there with a glass of iced tea in one hand was Margaret Holloway, president of the Black Ridge HOA. She looked at me with the same polished smile she wore at every neighborhood meeting, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, as if I were the stranger. For a second I honestly thought she was joking. Then I noticed the brass welcome sign hanging beside the door. Black Ridge Community Retreat. Property managed by the HOA. My stomach dropped. "Margaret," I said as calmly as I could, "you're standing in my house." She laughed softly, almost like she felt sorry for me. Behind her, I saw people carrying luggage through my grandfather's living room. Someone had moved my rocking chair beside the fireplace. The old quilt my grandmother stitched by hand covered a couch that didn't belong there. Family photographs had disappeared from the mantel. "Actually," Margaret replied, taking a slow sip of her tea, "this property now serves the community. You should have kept up with your responsibilities if you wanted to hold on to it." The mountain breeze suddenly felt colder. Resin from the pine trees mixed with the smell of fresh stain on the porch, and every familiar detail seemed just a little wrong. I looked past her shoulder and noticed a framed HOA logo hanging exactly where my grandfather's military portrait had always been. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a paperwork error. Someone had carefully planned every inch of this takeover while I was gone. Margaret smiled one more time before starting to close the door. "I'm afraid our guests value their privacy," she said. "You should leave before you embarrass yourself." I nodded once, stepped back off the porch, and quietly walked toward my truck. She thought I was giving up. She thought the mountain belonged to her now. What Margaret didn't know was that everyone inside that cabin had only one way off this mountain, and 3 generations before she ever arrived, my grandfather had made absolutely certain that road belonged to our family. I sat in my truck until the last glow of sunset faded behind the ridgeline, watching porch lights flicker on one by one like strangers celebrating inside a place that still carried my family name on the original county deed. Anger would not help me now. My grandfather used to say that mountains never rushed because they knew they would outlast everyone. I took a slow breath, rolled down the window, and let the cool evening air settle my thoughts. The scent of pine sap mixed with damp earth instantly carried me back 25 years to summers spent hauling firewood beside Grandpa Walter. He built that cabin in 1974 with his own hands after returning from years of working highway construction across Colorado. Every beam had a story. Every stone in the fireplace came from the creek less than half a mile away. When I was 8 years old, he pressed an old brass key into my palm and said, "A house is only wood until your family fills it with memories." That key was still hanging from my key ring. My father added the wraparound porch after I graduated high school. My mother planted the blue spruce trees lining the driveway. My grandmother stitched the quilt that I had just watched covering furniture chosen by someone else. Nothing about that place had ever belonged to the homeowners association. It belonged to generations of my family who had paid every tax bill, repaired every roof after heavy snow, and cleared every fallen tree after spring storms. Even after my parents passed away, I never considered selling it. I worked as a civil engineer because I loved building things that lasted, but that cabin reminded me that the strongest foundations were never poured in concrete. They were built with time. Black Ridge itself had changed over the years. When Grandpa first bought the land, there were only 6 cabins scattered across hundreds of acres of forest. Then developers arrived, carving expensive vacation homes into the hillsides and promising luxury mountain living. The Homeowners Association followed soon after, complete with glossy newsletters, architectural committees, and endless meetings about landscaping standards. Most of the neighbors accepted the rules because they wanted tidy streets and rising property values. I stayed polite but distant. My cabin had always existed outside their little world. The association maintained decorative entrances, organized holiday festivals, and collected dues from subdivision residents. But my property had never been included in their original development. Margaret knew that better than anyone. She approached me 3 different times over the past 4 years with offers to purchase the cabin. Each proposal came dressed in friendly language about preserving community character, expanding recreational space, and creating a mountain retreat for homeowners. Every time I thanked her for the offer and declined without hesitation. The last conversation still echoed in my mind. She stood beside her spotless sport utility vehicle wearing an expensive hiking jacket that had probably never touched a real trail and smiled as though she already knew the ending to a story I had not finished writing. "Everything has a price, Ethan," she told me. I smiled back and answered, "Some things only have an owner." She looked disappointed for exactly 1 second before that polished smile returned. At the time, I thought the conversation was over. Sitting alone beneath the darkening trees outside my own cabin, I finally realized it had only been the beginning. The next morning, the mountain wore its usual disguise. Sunlight spilled through the pine branches. Birds argued somewhere above the treetops, and a light breeze carried the clean scent of cedar across the valley. If I had arrived that morning without knowing what had happened, I would have believed it was the most peaceful place in Colorado. That was Margaret's greatest talent. She wrapped bad decisions in beautiful scenery until people forgot to ask questions. I drove into town just after sunrise and stopped at the little diner where my grandfather used to drink coffee every Saturday. The bell above the front door still rang with the same hollow chime, and the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits had not changed in 20 years. The waitress recognized me before I even sat down. She smiled, then hesitated. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I thought you moved away." Those 6 words told me everything. Someone had been rewriting my story while I was gone. I asked what she meant. She lowered her voice and glanced toward the window. "People said you sold the cabin months ago. Margaret told everyone the family finally decided to donate it for community use." Donate it. I almost laughed at how carefully she chose the lie. Selling could be questioned. Donating sounded generous. I thanked her, finished my coffee, and walked across the street to the small hardware store owned by Bill Harper, a man who had known my grandfather for nearly 40 years. Bill looked genuinely shocked when I walked inside. "You are supposed to be in Oregon," he said. "That is what the association newsletter claimed." He disappeared into the back office and returned carrying a glossy magazine with the Black Ridge logo across the front. There it was in full color. A photograph of my cabin beneath the headline announcing the future Black Ridge Mountain Retreat. According to the article, the property had been generously transferred for the benefit of the community after the owner permanently relocated for work. Every sentence sounded official. Every paragraph praised Margaret's leadership. There was only one problem. Not a single word was true. I could almost hear my grandfather chuckling. He always said that the most dangerous lies were the ones printed on expensive paper because people assumed somebody had checked the facts. I folded the newsletter and slipped it into my jacket. That was my first piece of evidence. By lunchtime, I had spoken with 6 longtime residents. Every conversation followed the same pattern. They believed I had willingly walked away. They believed the Homeowners Association had rescued an abandoned property. They believed Margaret because she had repeated the same story often enough that it became accepted as fact. Nobody had ever called me. Nobody had ever asked whether I actually agreed. They simply trusted the woman standing behind the microphone at monthly meetings. As I drove back toward the mountain, gravel crackled beneath my tires and my eyes drifted toward the narrow road climbing through the trees. Every delivery truck, every vacation renter, every maintenance crew, every guest heading to that cabin followed the exact same route. The road twisted around granite cliffs before disappearing into the forest, and there was no alternate entrance anywhere for miles. My grandfather insisted on buying that strip of land decades before anyone imagined luxury homes would cover the hillsides. At the time, people thought he was wasting money on an ordinary access road. Looking at it now, I realized he had quietly protected far more than a driveway. He had protected the only path anyone could use to reach the cabin that Margaret believed she had already taken from me. By mid-afternoon, I had enough questions to fill a courthouse, but questions alone never changed ownership records. Facts did. I parked outside the county administration building, where the air smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and fresh coffee drifting from a small office down the hall. The clerk behind the records counter recognized my last name immediately. She smiled politely until I asked for every document filed against my mountain property during the previous 12 months. Her expression changed. She disappeared into the archive room and returned carrying a stack of folders thick enough to make my stomach tighten. Building improvement requests, community maintenance notices, meeting resolutions, landscape approvals. Every page carried the Black Ridge Homeowners Association logo somewhere near the top. My signature appeared on several forms that I had never seen before. At first glance, they looked convincing, but the longer I studied them, the more obvious the problems became. Dates overlapped with weeks when I had been supervising bridge inspections hundreds of miles away. One approval supposedly came from my personal electronic mail address, even though I had never received the message. Another claimed I attended a homeowners association meeting while I was standing beside a construction site outside Denver according to payroll records that could prove my location by the hour. Someone had not simply bent the truth. They had built an entire paper trail around a person who never existed. The clerk quietly leaned closer across the counter. "Mr. Walker," she whispered, "I probably should not say this, but your property file has been requested an unusual number of times by the association over the past 6 months. She slid a visitor log toward me. Margaret Holloway's name appeared again and again, almost like she had been rehearsing before opening night. I thanked the clerk, requested certified copies of every document, and carried the growing stack back to my truck. The weight of those folders rested heavily on the passenger seat all the way up the mountain. Late that afternoon, I stopped along the overlook just below the cabin where I could see the entire property without being noticed. Vacation guests wandered across the porch carrying shopping bags. A delivery van backed carefully into the driveway. A landscaping crew unloaded fresh shrubs beside the stone walkway. Every person there behaved as though the place had belonged to the association forever. Then I noticed something even more interesting. Every vehicle arrived using the same narrow mountain road before turning through the wooden entrance where my grandfather had carved our family name decades earlier. No alternate driveway, no emergency access lane, no hidden service entrance. Just one winding stretch of gravel and pavement crossing land that my grandfather had insisted on purchasing separately long before any subdivision existed. I unfolded an old survey map that had lived inside my glove compartment for years. The faded ink showed property boundaries, elevation marks, and one bold line tracing that entire road from the county highway to the cabin. I remembered asking Grandpa why he always carried that map. He smiled and said, "People pay attention to houses. Smart landowners pay attention to how people reach them." Standing there with the cool mountain wind rustling through the pines, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Margaret believed she had secured the destination. She had completely ignored the journey that made reaching it possible. The evidence sitting on the passenger seat should have made me feel better, but instead it made the silence inside the truck even heavier. I had copies of forged signatures, misleading newsletters, suspicious meeting records, and a visitor log showing Margaret's unusual interest in my property. None of it instantly gave me my cabin back. Real life was never like the movies. You could know you were right and still spend months proving it. The following morning, I drove to the sheriff's office with a folder neatly organized by date. The receptionist greeted me with a friendly smile and asked me to wait. A few minutes later, Sheriff Daniel Brooks invited me into his office. He listened without interrupting while I laid every document across his desk. He compared signatures, studied the county records, and occasionally scribbled notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "I understand why you are upset, and there are definitely questions that need answers. But this appears to involve disputed property records and civil claims. Unless I have a court order or evidence of an immediate criminal violation, my authority is limited." It was not the answer I wanted, but it was an honest one. He was following the law instead of emotions. Before I left, he offered one piece of advice that stayed with me. "Do not lose your temper. If you are right, patience will protect you better than anger ever will." I thanked him and walked outside. The afternoon sun reflected off the courthouse windows while a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of pine from the mountains. I called an attorney recommended by an old coworker and scheduled the earliest available meeting. After reviewing my documents for nearly an hour, she looked up and said, "The paperwork raises serious concerns, but untangling this could take months. We need to verify every filing, every boundary, and every recorded easement before making our next move." Easement. That single word caught my attention. She noticed the expression on my face and asked if something came to mind. I admitted that my grandfather always seemed unusually protective of the access road leading to the cabin, but I had never questioned why. She nodded thoughtfully. "Bring me every survey, deed, and plat map your family ever kept, especially the older ones. Sometimes the oldest documents answer the newest problems." That evening, I returned to the small storage room behind the cabin's detached garage where I still had access to a locked metal cabinet that Margaret apparently had overlooked. Inside were weathered binders, rolled survey maps, faded tax receipts, and handwritten notes spanning decades. Dust floated through the beam of my flashlight as I carefully sorted through yellowed papers. Most of them confirmed things I already knew. Then I found an aging envelope with my grandfather's handwriting across the front. In thick black ink, he had written only 5 words. "Never forget the access road." I stared at that envelope for a long moment while the wind whispered through the surrounding pines. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped thinking about the cabin itself. Instead, I began thinking about the only path every guest, contractor, delivery driver, maintenance crew, and homeowners association event depended upon. And I had a feeling my grandfather had left me exactly what I needed to understand why that road mattered far more than anyone in Black Ridge had ever imagined. Early the next morning, I carried the envelope to my attorney's office with the same care my grandfather must have used when he sealed it decades earlier. The paper had yellowed with age, and the edges were worn from years of being folded, but the documents inside were remarkably clear. Original survey maps, certified county plats, a separate warranty deed recorded years before the subdivision even existed. My attorney spread everything across the conference table, adjusting each page until the property lines connected like pieces of a puzzle. For several quiet minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper and the ticking wall clock. Then she stopped, placed one finger on the survey, and looked directly at me. "Ethan," she said, "your grandfather was far more careful than anyone realized." She traced a bold line running from the county highway through the forest until it reached the cabin. "This access road is not part of the homeowners association. It is not owned by the county. It is not covered by any recorded permanent easement benefiting the association or the neighboring properties." I leaned closer, hardly believing what I was hearing. She continued reading through the recorded language. Every transfer of ownership had preserved the same legal description. My family owned not only the cabin, but the only private road leading to it. More importantly, there was no document granting unrestricted access to the homeowners association for commercial use, vacation rentals, or community events. Margaret had spent months collecting papers about the cabin while completely overlooking the one piece of land that made the cabin usable. My attorney smiled for the first time since I had walked into her office. "This changes everything," she said. "Do not misunderstand me. You still cannot act outside the law, but now we know exactly where the law stands." We immediately requested updated certified copies from the county recorder, along with a current title report confirming that no additional easements had ever been recorded. By late afternoon, every document supported the same conclusion. The legal ownership had never changed. The access rights had never expanded. The story circulating through Black Ridge had been built on assumptions instead of recorded facts. I drove back toward the mountain with the original survey map, resting safely inside a protective folder on the passenger seat. The road looked different now. Every curve, every culvert, every drainage ditch reminded me of afternoons spent walking beside my grandfather while he explained why foundations mattered more than appearances. He never rushed those conversations. He believed that understanding the land was just as important as building on it. Standing beside the entrance where the gravel met the county highway, I noticed something I had overlooked my entire life. The old boundary marker stamped with my family's parcel number was still firmly embedded beside the road, weathered but unmistakable. Hundreds of people had probably driven past it without giving it a second thought. Margaret almost certainly had done the same. She had focused on the cabin because it was visible. She had ignored the quiet details hidden in county records, survey maps, and fading property markers. That evening I made several phone calls, not to start an argument, but to begin a lawful process. A licensed surveyor agreed to verify every boundary. A contractor confirmed he could install a secure gate once all permits were approved. A title specialist promised written confirmation of every ownership record by the end of the week. For the first time since I found strangers living inside my family's cabin, I was no longer reacting to Margaret's plan. I was carefully building my own, one legal step at a time, exactly the way my grandfather would have wanted. 3 days later, every piece was finally in place. The county surveyor completed his field measurements and drove bright orange stakes into the ground exactly where the original property lines had always been. The title specialist delivered certified ownership records confirming what my grandfather had protected for decades. The contractor arrived just after sunrise with a trailer carrying a heavy steel gate, treated wooden posts, and a keypad system that could be installed without disturbing the surrounding forest. Before anyone lifted a single tool, my attorney handed me copies of every approved permit along with a formal written notice explaining that the private road would be temporarily closed except for authorized access until ongoing property disputes were resolved. Every page had been reviewed twice. Every signature was legitimate. Every step followed the law. I watched the crew work from the edge of the clearing while the crisp mountain air carried the familiar scent of pine needles and fresh sawdust. The steady rhythm of drills and hammers echoed through the valley, sounding almost peaceful compared to the arguments I had imagined having only a week earlier. There would be no shouting. There would be no dramatic confrontation. The law did not need raised voices. It only needed patience. By early afternoon, the gate stood across the entrance exactly where my grandfather's survey map had indicated the private boundary began. A simple sign was mounted beside it. Private road. Access restricted. Unauthorized entry prohibited. Contact property owner for authorized access. Nothing about the wording was emotional. It stated facts and nothing more. Security cameras were installed facing both directions, so every vehicle entering or leaving would be recorded. That evening, my attorney personally delivered formal notices to the Homeowners Association office and electronically served copies to their legal representative. Margaret could no longer claim she did not know the road was privately owned. She could no longer argue that the closure appeared without warning. Everything had been documented. Everything had been delivered. The following morning, I parked near the entrance before sunrise with a cup of black coffee warming my hands. Fog drifted between the trees while birds greeted the new day above the quiet forest. Around 7:30, the first landscaping truck arrived. The driver slowed, read the sign, and stopped before the closed gate. A few minutes later, another vehicle pulled in carrying cleaning supplies for the vacation rental. Soon a food delivery van joined the growing line. Nobody argued. Most simply looked confused, made a telephone call, and waited. Around 8:15, Margaret's white sport utility vehicle appeared around the bend. She stepped out wearing the same confident expression I remembered from the porch, but it faded the moment she recognized the survey markers, the cameras, and the certified notices attached to the gate inside weatherproof document holders. She walked toward me holding a folder under one arm. "You cannot do this," she declared. I calmly handed her another certified copy of the title report and the survey. "Actually," I replied, "everything here has already been reviewed by the county, my attorney, and a licensed surveyor." She flipped through the pages without saying a word. For the first time since I returned to Black Ridge, she was not smiling. More vehicles continued arriving behind her, each one stopping at the same closed gate, each one depending on the same road she had never bothered to understand. Standing there in the cool mountain air, listening to engines idle beneath towering pines, I realized my grandfather had been right all along. People usually notice the destination. Very few ever think about who owns the road that quietly makes every destination possible. Within an hour, the quiet entrance to Black Ridge looked more like the parking lot outside a county fair than the peaceful mountain road everyone expected. Delivery vans waited behind landscaping trailers. Housekeeping staff checked their phones while vacation guests stepped out of their sport utility vehicles, wondering why nobody could continue up the mountain. The line kept growing because there simply was nowhere else to go. Every navigation system pointed to the same narrow road, and every driver reached the same locked gate with the same official notice attached beside it. I remained exactly where I had been all morning, leaning against my truck with a folder of certified documents resting on the hood. There was no reason to argue. The paperwork spoke more clearly than I ever could. Around 9 o'clock, Sheriff Daniel Brooks arrived after receiving several calls requesting assistance. He parked calmly, greeted both sides, and spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the survey maps, title report, permits, and legal notices my attorney had already provided to his office. He walked the property line with the county surveyor, examined the boundary markers, and compared the coordinates to the official plat. When he returned, his expression remained professional and steady. The county records confirm this is a privately owned access road, he said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. The current restrictions appear to match the permits and documentation presented today. Any disagreement over the property itself must continue through the civil process. Those words changed the atmosphere almost instantly. Conversations that had sounded confident only minutes earlier became noticeably quieter. Several contractors packed their equipment and left after realizing they had no legal way to continue their work. Vacation guests contacted rental companies asking why they had never been informed about the ownership dispute before making reservations. Delivery drivers marked packages for delayed service and turned back toward town. Margaret stood silently beside her vehicle, flipping through the certified copies for what must have been the 10th time. She occasionally looked toward the cabin, then back toward the gate, as though hoping another entrance would somehow appear. None did. My attorney arrived shortly before noon carrying another folder containing responses from the county recorder's office. She handed copies to the sheriff, to Margaret, and to the association's attorney, who had finally arrived after the growing situation demanded legal attention. The discussion remained calm, respectful, and entirely focused on documents rather than emotions. By mid-afternoon, the association's attorney requested a private conversation with Margaret. They stepped several yards away beneath a stand of tall pines, speaking quietly while occasionally glancing toward the survey markers and title records. When they returned, the confidence that had defined Margaret's posture for months had disappeared. She informed the remaining contractors that all renovation work at the cabin was suspended until further notice. The vacation rental listings disappeared from the association website before sunset. Maintenance appointments scheduled for the following week were canceled. One decision after another quietly unraveled because each one had depended upon a property claim that no longer matched the verified records. As the sun settled behind the mountains, the line of waiting vehicles gradually disappeared, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the trees and the familiar scent of pine drifting across the valley. I looked at the old brass key still hanging from my key ring and thought about my grandfather's handwritten note. He never told me to fight louder than anyone else. He simply reminded me never to forget the access road, because sometimes the smallest line on an old survey map becomes the strongest foundation for justice many years later. Over the next several weeks, the mountain slowly returned to sounding the way I remembered it as a child. The endless stream of contractors disappeared. Vacation advertisements vanished from the internet. The decorative banners announcing the community retreat came down one by one until nothing remained except the original cedar cabin standing quietly beneath the towering pines. The legal process continued exactly as my attorney predicted. Certified records, survey reports, electronic communications, and county filings established a timeline that was far more persuasive than rumors or speeches. Faced with the documented history, the Homeowners Association formally acknowledged that my family had never transferred ownership of the cabin or the private access road. The unauthorized occupancy ended peacefully. Personal belongings belonging to the temporary occupants were removed through an agreed schedule, and the property was returned to my possession. Standing on the porch with the original brass key in my hand, I unlocked the front door for the first time in months. The familiar click echoed through the quiet house, followed by the unmistakable scent of aged cedar, stone, and pine that no amount of fresh paint could ever replace. Sunlight poured through the front windows, landing across the hardwood floor where my grandfather used to spread old survey maps every Sunday afternoon. My grandmother's quilt had been carefully folded and left on the rocking chair. The military portrait that once hung above the fireplace had been returned after the association completed the inventory requested during the legal proceedings. I carried each family photograph back to its original place, taking my time because every frame felt like another piece of home finding its way back. Outside, the wind chimes continued their gentle song, while the blue spruce trees my mother planted years earlier swayed in the afternoon breeze. A few days later, I received notice that the Homeowners Association Board had elected new leadership following a special meeting. Several internal policies regarding property verification, record-keeping, and communication with homeowners were revised after independent legal review. Those decisions belonged to the community, not to me, but I hoped they would prevent another family from experiencing what mine had endured. Sheriff Brooks stopped by one afternoon simply to shake my hand. He smiled and said, "The system can move slowly, but it works best when people respect it." I thanked him because he had treated every step with fairness from the very beginning. Before leaving, he looked down the quiet road stretching toward the county highway and nodded with quiet appreciation. After he drove away, I walked the familiar path my grandfather and I had traveled hundreds of times. The old boundary marker still stood exactly where it always had, weathered by snow, rain, and countless seasons, yet refusing to move even an inch. I brushed away a little dirt from the engraved parcel number and smiled. So much of this story had never really been about a cabin. It had been about patience, preparation, and remembering the value of details that other people ignored. Margaret spent months trying to claim the destination while overlooking the road that made the destination possible. My grandfather understood something she never did. Ownership is not measured by confidence, popularity, or loud meetings. It is measured by truth that can withstand careful examination. As the evening sun settled behind Black Ridge, warm light filled the porch and the scent of pine drifted through the open windows once again. I slipped the old brass key back into my pocket, listened to the peaceful silence surrounding my family's mountain home, and realized that justice had never arrived with shouting or revenge. It arrived one patient document, one honest record, and one forgotten road at a time.